I keep a shop at the back of a property I bought 2 years after my divorce, on a gravel road outside Staunton, Virginia, where the Blue Ridge starts to flatten into the valley floor. The shop is a converted outbuilding, maybe 100 years old, board and batten siding, a wood stove in the corner that I feed oak scraps into from October through March. I restore furniture. Chairs mostly, though I'll take a table or a cabinet if the bones are good. I strip the old finish, work the joints back tight, fill the cracks, oil the wood until it looks like something again. People drop things off and pick them up and generally don't stay long. That suits me fine. My name is Seth Calloway. I was married for 6 years to a woman named Diana. We met in our late 20s, when we were both different people, or at least I thought we were. The divorce was not dramatic. There was no affair, no blow-up, no single moment I can point to. We just became strangers to each other slowly, the way a room gets cold when no one thinks to feed the fire. The house we'd shared went to Diana. The equity split paid for the property in Staunton. I was 38 when I moved in. I told myself the quiet was what I needed. For a while it was. I had met Diana's younger sister, Faye, at a family barbecue the summer before the wedding. She was 23 then, still in graduate school for early childhood education, and she had this way of listening to people that made you feel like you were the only person in the yard. Diana introduced us. Faye shook my hand, and that was the beginning and the end of it. After that, she was just part of the family landscape, holidays, birthdays, Diana's mother's kitchen at Christmas. We never had a real conversation alone. There was no reason to. What I noticed, and then put away and stopped noticing, was that Faye was the one who always asked how I was doing, and actually waited for the answer. At Thanksgiving one year, Diana snapped at me in front of everyone for forgetting to bring the wine she'd asked for. Faye was across the table. She caught my eye for just a second and gave me the smallest nod. The kind that means I saw that and you're okay. I looked away. I did not think about it again for a long time. The divorce was finalized in March. By June I was in Staunton. By the following spring I had the shop running and a small list of regular clients, estate sales, antique dealers, a couple of old families in the valley who had pieces they wanted kept up. I worked 6 days a week. I ran in the mornings. I cooked simple food and ate at the kitchen table and read in the evenings. I did not date. I was not ready to date and I was aware enough to know it. Diana and I had no children, and we had divided our friends the way you do, silently without a meeting. I lost touch with her family naturally. I had not thought about Faye in probably 2 years when the call came. It was a Tuesday morning in September. I was in the middle of fitting a new rush seat on a ladder-back chair, the kind of work that takes both hands and most of your attention. My phone was on the workbench. I let it go to voicemail. I listened to the message an hour later when I was washing my hands at the utility sink. Seth, it's Faye, Diana's sister. A pause. I know this is strange. I'm not sure why I'm calling you, honestly. I'm in Waynesboro right now and I don't really know what to do next. You don't have to call back. I'm sorry to bother you. That was all. I stood there with my hands still dripping over the sink and played it again. Then I called her back. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was level but thin, the way a voice gets when someone has been holding something together through an effort of will. I said, Faye, it's Seth. What's going on? She told me in a few short sentences. She had been engaged to a man named Philip for almost 2 years. Philip had a good job, a nice apartment in Richmond, and as it turned out, a woman he had been seeing on the side for most of the time he and Faye had been together. Faye had found out 3 days ago. She had packed what she could fit in her car and left. She had driven west without a real plan. Her mother lived in Harrisonburg, but the relationship there was complicated. Diana was staying with their mother, and Faye was not ready to walk into that house and sit across the table from her sister and explain what had happened. She had pulled off the interstate in Waynesboro and checked into a motel, and had been sitting there since yesterday afternoon, trying to figure out what came next. I don't have a lot of good options right now, she said. I'm not asking you to fix anything. I remembered you were out here somewhere and I thought maybe you could tell me about a decent place to eat. I almost laughed, not unkindly. I said, I can do better than that. I have a spare room. It's not much, but it's quiet. There was a long pause. Seth, we're not really family anymore, I know, but you called me, so come have dinner and then you can decide. She came. She pulled up the gravel drive around 6 o'clock in a car packed so tightly I could see bags pressed against the back windows. She got out and looked at the property in the evening light, the old farmhouse, the shop behind it, the field running back toward the tree line, and she said, This is really something. I said, It's a lot of work, she said. That's not what I meant. We ate on the back porch. I had made chili from a recipe I'd been using for years, cornbread from a box, a salad I put together from whatever was in the refrigerator. Nothing impressive. She ate like someone who hadn't eaten properly in days, which I suspected was the case, and we talked about small things. The drive through the valley, the way the mountains looked at this hour, whether the old stove in the kitchen was original to the house. We did not talk about Philip. We did not talk about Diana. At the end of the evening I showed her the spare room. It was clean and plain, a bed with a quilt my grandmother had made, a dresser, a window that looked out over the field. She stood in the doorway for a moment. She said, "Just a few days. I don't want to impose." I said, "Take the time you need." She stayed. The first week she kept mostly to herself. She slept late, took long walks down the gravel road, sat on the porch with coffee and her phone and worked through whatever she was working through. I left her to it. I went to the shop in the mornings and stayed until late afternoon. If she was around when I came in, I would offer tea or ask if she wanted company, and sometimes she said yes and sometimes she said no, and I let both answers be fine. On the 5th day she appeared in the doorway of the shop while I was cleaning up, arms crossed against the October cold, and asked if I needed help with anything. I looked at the shop. There was a set of 6 dining chairs that needed stripping. Dusty work, nothing complicated. I said, "Do you mind getting your hands dirty?" She said, "I taught kindergarten for 8 years. My hands are already dirty." She was good at it. Patient, methodical. She did not rush the stripper or skip steps. She asked questions when she didn't know something and listened when I explained. We worked side by side for 3 hours and talked the way people talk when they're both looking at something else. Easily, without the weight of eye contact. She told me about her students, about the particular way a 5-year-old learns to trust you, about a boy named Tyler who had taken a whole semester to stop hiding under his desk during reading time, and how the day he didn't was the best day she'd had in years. I told her about a wardrobe I'd restored the year before that had turned out to have a false back. Not a secret compartment, just a sloppy repair someone had made decades ago. But the moment I'd found it had felt like something. She said, "That's what I like about old things. They have already survived something." I did not know what to say to that, so I said nothing, but I thought about it for a long time after she went in for the night. She called the school district in Staunton in the 2nd week. There was a 3rd grade class that had been without a permanent teacher since August, a situation the principal described as pressing, and Faye had her certification and her 8 years, and she could start on a conditional basis while the paperwork went through. She took the job. She drove to Harrisonburg one afternoon to get the rest of her things from a storage unit her mother had helped her set up, and she came back that evening with 2 more bags and a box of books and a small clay pot a student had made her years ago, and she put the pot on the windowsill in the spare room and seemed, for the first time since she'd arrived, like someone who had decided something. I did not let myself think about what I was noticing. I was good at that. I had spent 6 years in a marriage, practicing a kind of careful inattention, learning to look past things, and the habit did not leave you just because the marriage had. But there were moments. The morning she drove to Harrisonburg, I found myself standing in the kitchen for too long after she left, not doing anything in particular. When she came back, I was still in the shop, and I heard her car on the gravel and I recognized the sound of it, which surprised me because I had not been aware of memorizing it. One evening she brought a cup of coffee out to the shop without being asked. She set it on the stool beside my bench and started to leave. I said, "You don't have to go." She stayed. She sat on a turned-over crate by the wood stove, and we talked for 2 hours about things that did not matter and some things that did, and when she finally went inside, she paused in the doorway and said, "Thank you, Seth." And I said, "For what?" And she shook her head a little, like the answer was too obvious to say. 3 weeks in, while we were sorting through a box of small hardware I'd bought at an estate sale, hinges, drawer pulls, a few old cabinet locks, she said, without looking up from the box, "Can I ask you something that is probably none of my business?" I said she could. She said, "What happened with you and Diana?" She never really told me. I set down the drawer pull I was examining. I thought about it honestly for a moment. I said, "I don't think either of us did anything wrong. I think we just ran out of something." I tried for a long time to figure out what it was, and the best I could come up with is that we ran out of wanting to know each other. Does that make sense? She was quiet. Then she said, "She mentioned once that you were hard to reach, that you didn't open up." I said, "That's probably fair," she said. "For what it's worth, you seem pretty reachable to me." I didn't answer that. I picked up the drawer pull again and turned it over in my hand. But something in the room had shifted and we both knew it. The second thing she asked me, a few days later, was the one I thought about more. She said, "Did you know at Diana's wedding that things weren't right? We were eating dinner. I put down my fork. Why are you asking that?" She looked at her plate. "Because I left halfway through. I told everyone I wasn't feeling well. But that was not the whole truth." She looked up. "I left because watching you sit at that table with that look on your face was, I don't know, it was hard to watch. You looked like a man who had already made peace with something he hadn't agreed to." I sat with that for a long moment. I said, "I didn't know what it was at the time. I think I knew something." She nodded and did not say anything else, and we finished dinner and washed the dishes side by side, and at some point her shoulder was against mine at the sink, and neither of us moved away. I want to be honest about how this went, because it did not go the way things go in stories where everyone knows what they want and acts on it cleanly. I was full. I had been hurt, not dramatically, but in the slow, dull way that leaves you uncertain of your own instincts. And she was 3 weeks out of an engagement that had gutted her. I was aware of the math. I did not want to be something she leaned on because she had nothing else to lean on. So I was careful. Maybe too careful. One evening she was sitting at the kitchen table grading papers. She had started bringing work home by then, and there was something that felt very normal about that. Her red pen moving across the pages while I sat across from her reading, and I looked up and she was already looking at me. She said, "You're doing that thing again." I said, "What thing?" She said, deciding not to say something. I put the book down. I said, "Faye." She said, "Seth." I said, "This is complicated." She said, "I know it's complicated. I'm the one who made it complicated by knocking on your door." I said, "I don't want you to be here because you have nowhere else to go. I want you to be here because you want to be here." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I had somewhere to go. I could have gone to my mother's. I could have called 3 different friends in Richmond. I drove past the Harrisonburg exit, Seth. I kept going. I looked at her. She looked back at me. She said, "I think I've been driving toward this for a long time and I just needed a reason to stop pretending I wasn't." I didn't say anything. I got up, walked to the other side of the table, and she stood up to meet me, and that was the end of being careful. What I did not tell her that night was that Diana had called me 2 days earlier. I want to say that first, before I explain what happened next, because I am still not proud of the fact that I didn't tell her immediately. Diana had called my cell on a Thursday afternoon. I was in the shop. I had almost not answered, but I did. She said, "Seth, I know this is probably the last thing you want to hear from me, but I need to ask you something and I need you to be honest." I said I would try. She said, "Is Faye staying with you?" I said, "Yes." There was a silence. Then she said, "For how long?" I said, "I don't know." Another silence, longer than, "Okay." Not angry, exact. "Okay, that's okay, I just wanted to know." She hung up. That was the whole call. I had not told Faye because I did not know what to make of it, and I did not want to make it into something before I understood what it was. That was the honest reason. The less honest reason was that things between Faye and me were just starting to feel possible, and I did not want to hand her a reason to second-guess any of it. I told her the next morning, over coffee. I told her all of it. She listened without interrupting. When I was done, she was quiet for a long time. She looked out the window at the field, which was gray and frostbitten, the grass flat and pale in the November light. She said, "How did she sound?" I said, "Like someone trying to sound neutral." She nodded slowly. She wrapped her hands around her mug. She said, "Faye and Diana do not have a simple relationship. I should probably tell you that. She's my sister and I love her. But some of the ways we've moved through the world have put us in each other's way. I'm not going to pretend I don't know that this is one of them." I said, "Does that change anything for you?" She looked at me. She said, "No." "Does it change anything for you?" I said, "No." She nodded again and took a sip of her coffee, and that was the last time we talked about it for a while. Diana came to Staunton in December. She did not call ahead. I heard a car in the driveway on a Saturday morning when I was in the shop. An engine I did not recognize, and I came around the corner of the building and found her standing in the cold in a good coat, looking at the house. She turned when she heard me. She looked the same, mostly. She looked tired. She said I should have called. I said, "Yeah." We stood there for a moment. I asked if she wanted to come in. She said no, she wasn't staying. She just wanted to say something face to face and then she would leave. I said, all right. She said, I'm not here to make trouble. I need you to know that. I'm here because. She stopped. She looked at the shop. She said, you look good, Seth. I mean that, you look like you fit here. I said, I think I do. She said, I was hard on you when we were married. I don't know if I've ever said that plainly. I said, we were both trying. She said, I know. But I think I took things out on you that had nothing to do with you. And I never said that. She paused. I don't know if Faye told you about our mother, about the way things were growing up. Faye got the better deal, honestly. Younger kid always does. By the time she was growing up, our mom had already softened, I guess. I had the harder version. She shook her head. None of that is an excuse. I'm just trying to explain. I said, Diana, you don't owe me an explanation, she said. Maybe not, but I owe myself one. She pulled her coat tighter. Is she here? I said, she's inside. She nodded. She looked at the house for a moment. She said, tell her I'm not angry. I'm working on it. I'm not all the way there, but I'm working on it. Then she walked back to her car and drove away. I watched the gravel settle after her, and then I stood there in the cold for another minute, just breathing, and then I went inside. Faye was in the kitchen. She had heard the car, had looked out the window, had seen. She was standing with her back against the counter, arms folded. I said, she said she's not angry. She said she's working on it. Faye didn't say anything for a second. Then her eyes filled up, not with sadness exactly, but with that particular kind of relief that has nowhere to go. She said, that's the most Diana thing she could have said. I walked over and she let me put my arms around her, and she put her face against my shoulder, and we stood like that in the kitchen for a while, not saying anything, listening to the wood stove tick and settle in the next room. That winter was the first one in a long time that I didn't feel long. Faye moved the rest of her things in after the new year, not in a dramatic way, not with a conversation where we decided anything. Her boxes just gradually outnumbered mine in the back hallway, and her students' drawings started appearing on the refrigerator, and there was always now a second coffee cup on the counter in the morning. The clay pot her student had made sat on the kitchen windowsill and caught the light in the afternoons. By spring, she had 22 third graders who would have done anything for her, and I had a waiting list for the first time. I hired a kid named Aaron from the local technical college to help on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I got the farmhouse re-roofed before the wet season. Small things. The kind of things you do when you've stopped thinking of a place as temporary. One afternoon in March, she came out to the shop after school while I was finishing up a drop-leaf table, walnut, late 19th century, one hinge replaced at some point. She sat on the crate by the stove and took off her shoes and stretched her feet toward the heat and told me about her day, a story about a girl named Maya who had read her first full sentence out loud that morning and burst into tears immediately after, the happy, terrified kind. I was sanding the table with the grain, slow passes, listening. She said, I've been thinking about something. I said, tell me. She said, I drove past the Harrisonburg exit because I was scared that if I stopped, I'd talk myself out of it, out of coming here. And I almost did it anyway, almost pulled over in Fishersville and just sat there until I convinced myself it was a bad idea. I stopped sanding. I looked at her. She said, I just wanted to tell you that, in case you ever wonder if any of this was accidental. I set the sandpaper down on the table. I walked over to the stove and sat down beside her on the crate, which was not large enough for two people but held us anyway. I said, I knew. She said, how? I thought about it. I thought about the sound of her car on the gravel the day she'd come back from Harrisonburg. I thought about the coffee cup on the stool. I thought about the way she had looked at the field out the kitchen window on that gray November morning, deciding something by not deciding it. I said, the same way you sand with the grain. You stop fighting the direction the thing wants to go. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, that is either very wise or very corny. I said, probably both. She leaned her head on my shoulder and looked at the walnut table, which was almost done. She said, it's going to be beautiful. She was not talking about the table. The following October, on a Saturday afternoon when the valley was at its most unreasonable, all red and gold above the ridgeline, we got married in the backyard of the farmhouse. 14 people. Her colleague from school who had become a genuine friend, Aaron from the shop. A handful of people from my side, my brother and his kids, my aunt from Roanoke who cried through most of it. No venue, no catering, no photographer except Faye's friend who volunteered. The ceremony was short. The food was long. The fire pit went until midnight. Diana was not there. We had not asked her, and I don't think she would have come if we had. But 2 weeks before the wedding, A package arrived at the farmhouse, no card. Inside was a small framed print, a watercolor of the Shenandoah Valley in autumn, the kind of thing you find in a good antique shop and know immediately is right. On the back in Diana's handwriting, "Be happy, I mean it." Faye stood in the kitchen holding it for a long time. Then she put it on the wall beside the window where the clay pot lives, and there it has stayed. Our daughter was born the following August. We named her Ruth, after no one in particular, just because it felt solid, like something that would hold. She has Faye's eyes and apparently my stubbornness, which Faye maintains is not a compliment but says with a smile. Last week Ruth started pulling herself up on the coffee table legs and then standing there with this expression of absolute astonishment at herself, like she could not believe she had done it. Faye was sitting on the floor beside her, hands out, not holding her up but there in case. I was in the doorway watching, and Faye looked up and caught my eye, and I don't have the words for the look she gave me, except that it was the kind of look that answers a question you didn't know you'd been asking. I go out to the shop most mornings before the house is awake. I feed the stove, I get the work going, and sometimes I'll stop for a minute, coffee in hand, and look at the chairs waiting in the corner or the table in the middle of the floor, the ones that came in beaten up and wrong, and I think about what it takes to make a thing right again. You strip what isn't working. You work the joints back tight. You fill what's missing and oil what's dry, and then you let it be what it is. You don't force the grain. You work with it slowly, until the thing under all the damage finally shows up. That's the whole job, really. The rest of it takes care of itself.